I'm delighted to welcome our speaker for this session, Professor John Walton, who is joining us from Chicago. Dr. Walton is Professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College in the USA, where he has been a member of the faculty for nearly 20 years. Dr. Walton's first degree was in economics and accounting, but then he became aware of the importance of archaeology and cultural studies in understanding the Bible. This field of study became his vocation. He obtained a master's from Wheaton Graduate School and a PhD from Hebrew Union College, which is a Jewish seminary. For the next 20 years, he taught at the Moody Bible Institute before taking up his current position at Wheaton in 2001. He has published almost 30 books, including commentaries, reference works, textbooks, and popular academic books, and his books have received a number of prestigious awards. His areas of expertise include the importance of the ancient Near East for interpreting the Old Testament, as well as the dialogue between science and faith. Professor Walton will be giving us 2 lectures today. This first one is entitled Understanding Genesis, Insights from the Study of Ancient Near East Cultures. So John, welcome back to the Faraday Institute, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you. It's good to be part of your program. So we're trying to tell a better story. If we're going to tell a better story about faith and science, we have to start by telling a better story with regard to the Bible. What is it that the Bible is saying? How do we read it well? How do we understand what its impact is? And so we have to start by trying to understand the Bible within its cultural context. And so we're going to be looking at how the Bible communicates and what it communicates. When we begin then, we recognize that the Bible's claims must be understood contextually. The Bible was written in a context. It was written to ancient Israelites who lived in the ancient Near East. And therefore, that's the approach that we have to take to understand that context. Because the Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. It's in a different language, it's in a different culture, and much of the communication has cultural aspects connected to it. When we read the Bible, we read it from our own context. And we do eventually want to know how its message is relevant to us today. But the fact is that reading instinctively is not reliable because we bring so much of our world and culture into that reading. Our task then is to try to push aside, as much as we can, it's difficult, push aside our own cultural ways of thinking to try to understand their culture. The metaphor I use for this is a cultural river, and we need to immerse ourselves in their cultural river. Science is part of our cultural river, but we need to understand what they are communicating in their cultural river. So if we're going to understand cultural river, let's start with our modern cultural river. And I know we've got people in the audience from all around the world, but I'm going to use the example of an American cultural river. What are some of the things that are aspects of American culture? Lots of you will recognize many of them, even if you are from another country. You can see that they involve things like politics, values, science, even psychology kinds of things. Economics, all of these things are part of our current cultural river. Now, what's important to recognize is that the ancient Israelites, the ones writing the Bible and the ones it was written to in the ancient world, do not know any of those terms that are up on the screen right now. They wouldn't even recognize the words, let alone what they referred to. They do not know our cultural river, and they are not addressing our cultural river. So I don't expect to open up the book of Proverbs and find verses about social media. I don't expect to open up the book of Kings and find discussions of monarchy versus democracy. I don't expect to open up Deuteronomy and find discussions of market economy or capitalism or an agro-pastoral economy. And I shouldn't expect to open up Genesis and find discussions of science, of expanding universe or Big Bang cosmology. The Bible is written in its cultural river. So if we're going to understand the Bible, we have to try to set aside our cultural river and think about theirs. What is this cultural river of the ancient world? Well, again, we'll just put up a sampling of some of the things that we find in the ancient cultural river. When we look at some of these words, we might feel like we understand them. We could figure them out. So we say kingship. I know what kingship is. Yes, but the way that we think about kingship in our modern world is not at all the way they thought about kingship in the ancient world. So we have to understand that even when we recognize the terms may have totally different baggage connected to them. So if we're going to understand the biblical text well and the story that it is telling, we need to try to set aside our stories and read theirs, to try to understand their cultural river. Now, that's very difficult to do because, of course, we don't have any informants. We don't have anybody that we can talk to about what that would have been like. It's not a living culture today. But if we only get so far as being able to recognize aspects of our cultural river and set those off to the side, we'll be making progress. We'll be able to tell a different story. So we need to think then about Genesis 1 as an example of how things would have been understood in the ancient world. How would have they told their story? So let's start with the idea of creation. When we understand the cultural river of the Bible, we can tell the Bible's story better. What is the Bible's story about creation? When we tell the story of creation in our modern cultural river, we're telling a science story because science pretty much drives our modern cultural river. And so when we would think about the kind of creation story we might tell today, it would largely be a science story. But what kind of creation story is it that we have in the Bible? What kind of creation story is it? So let's think about an example. Let's say that you were going to a play in a city near you, and you were very excited about it, but the day came and there was nothing but trouble. It was bad weather, there was heavy traffic, there were difficulties parking, and by the time you've gotten to the theater, you're a half an hour late. So sad. But you walk to your seat and kind of squeeze through the aisle to your seat, and you poke the person next to you and say, "How did the play begin?" Now, this is a very congenial person, willing to help, and so they turn to you and they say, "This play was written in the early 20th century. It was a Pulitzer Prize candidate at that time, and it was popular. No, 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 you say, I don't want to know about the writing of the script. Well, he says, how in the world can you have a play without a script? You wanted to know how the play began. It began with the writing of a script. No, you say, that's not what I want. Yeah, well, okay. So this stage was built in the 1950s. It was a specialty black box theater, and it was built specifically. No, 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 you say. I don't care about the stage. How did the play begin? Well, he replies, you can't have a play without a stage. I know that, but that's not what I want to know. Well, okay, he says. So this set was designed by the Johnson Company, and they specialize in these kinds of black box theaters. And notice how the design, no, you say. You really don't want to know about the set. Well, the set is part of the play. How can, okay. The cast was chosen by the casting company that specializes. No, will you please tell me what's happened since the curtain opened? Oh, you're interested in the action. Now notice in this example, all of those are correct answers. All of them explain how the play began. And it's true that they're interrelated. You need all of them to have the play. But your interest when you asked the question was a particular interest. It's not that you didn't recognize that other aspects were involved. And so when we talk about the biblical account of creation, we're asking, how did the world begin? And there could be many different answers to that question, not contradictory answers, not in conflict, but just focusing on different things. Going back to the illustration, in our world, we're probably most interested in the stage, the building of the stage. That's the cosmos, the universe. That's what science tells us. And that's the way that we would tend to answer the question. But what about Israel? How would they answer the question? What's most important to them? That's the story that we want to get to. That's this better story. So we have to try to understand then the Bible in the ancient Near East. How does it operate in relationship to the world around it? The first point I want to make is that I would consider the Bible to be embedded in the ancient world, but not indebted to particular pieces of literature. Lots of times when people talk about the Bible, the Old Testament in the ancient Near East, they're talking about whether Israel borrowed this piece of literature, that piece of literature. And that's a very difficult question to answer, and it's really not of interest to me here. We're not talking about indebtedness, but yet the Israelites are embedded in an ancient culture. They're not in a cultural vacuum. They're embedded in an ancient culture, and that culture is revealed in multitudes of ways as we read the Bible. You know this well because when you read the Old Testament, you get to lots of places and you say, I have no idea what it's talking about. Maybe you're in Leviticus. Maybe you're in Deuteronomy. Maybe you're in some of the stories like the golden calf. What in the world's going on there? And so we recognize that we are culturally distant. And that makes some of the texts difficult to understand. But the ancient audience wouldn't have had any difficulty understanding them. So in this sense, what we're doing is trying to understand the text in its context. We're not trying to import something into the text or impose something on the text. We're trying to understand what the culture in which the text is embedded. So for instance, if I were to start talking about this Hebrew word or that Hebrew word in Genesis, You would never say, well, why are you imposing Hebrew on the biblical text? Of course not, because you would understand the biblical text was written in Hebrew. So that's not an imposition. And it's the same thing with the culture of the ancient world. The biblical text was written into that culture. So ancient Near Eastern texts become important to us, not because we think that the Bible borrowed from them or just reshaped them. It's not because we think that the ancient Near Eastern texts are as valuable theologically as the Bible, but rather the ancient Near Eastern texts can prompt us to think differently, to think about the text in light of that cultural river. The ancient Near Eastern texts give us access to the cultural river of the ancient world. They provide windows of how people thought and the way they put things together. And that can help us to avoid the anachronism that happens when we impose our own values, our own culture, our own story on the Bible. The ancient Near East provides the basis by which we can understand the ancient cultural river in which Israel is embedded. And it's better to tell their story. The ancient text can help us to do that. Now, I want to give you just one example of the kinds of things that I'm talking about. In our world, we often talk about the distinction between natural and supernatural. And so we talk about things like miracles, which means that they're not natural, they're supernatural. They can't be explained naturally. We talk about God intervening in the natural world to do things that are not natural. So much of our conversation about these things depends on that distinction between natural and supernatural. When we look into the ancient world, however, we find, perhaps to our surprise, that nothing is natural in the ancient Near East. There is no natural. They have things like ordinary and extraordinary, normal and abnormal, but they don't have natural or supernatural. And that's because they believed that God was involved in everything. Now, if the Bible has no designation of natural, no idea of that category, then of course they can't designate something as not natural. You see, the two depend on each other. In the ancient world, God is the agent, even in the things that we call natural. God was doing it all. And therefore, whether we can define something as natural or not, the Bible believed God was involved. It does us no good then to ask questions about the plague or the plagues of the flood or the thunder from Mount Sinai or creation and ask questions about natural or supernatural. God is involved in it all. And so it changes how we read the text when we understand God's involvement. That brings us now to a discussion of the claims of Genesis 1. What is it that Genesis 1 is affirming? See, that's when we talk about the message of the Bible. We want to know what it affirms, because that's what we're committed to. That's what we're accountable to. So when I look at Genesis 1, in light of the ancient Near East, I look at the story that they're telling. And I would propose that it's a story about role and purpose in an ordered system. The highest value in the ancient world was order. And therefore, the one who established order was most important. The one who established order is the one who's doing the creating. Creation means establishing order in the ancient world and in the Bible. And order involves everything having its role and everything working together toward a purpose Our cultural river can't talk very easily about purpose. Science has trouble identifying things like that. But that's what the Bible's most interested in. That's the story they want to tell. That means that when Genesis 1 is telling its story, it's not so much interested in cosmic origins, by which I mean scientific cosmic origins. It's interested in cosmic identity. What is the cosmos? That's what they want to know. In that sense, it's something like a vision statement for the cosmos. Many of us work in organizations that have vision statements, whether it's a church or a company, whatever it might be. And the vision statement gives focus and identity to the corporation. And so likewise in Genesis 1, the story is about the identity of the cosmos. What is this world around us? Now, today we're also interested in identity, and we're also interested in order. So those things haven't changed. It's just we have found answers to those things in science. And that's not where the Bible finds its answers to those things. It might help us to consider another illustration. I would suggest that the Genesis 1 account is not about building a house, but it's about making a house a home. There's a difference between a house story and a home story. Let's take a look at some of those. So first of all, we can think about building a house. This is how we think in our modern cultural river. When we think about science and the way that it talks about cosmic origins, we're viewing creation as a house story. That's what that story is meant to do. And for that kind of story, it's science that provides the plot. And that's what happens in our modern cultural river. And so we think of creation that way. A house is what you live in, and it's important. Now, on the other hand, I'm going to suggest that the Bible is more interested in the home story. This is the ancient cultural river. Now, of course, you can't have a home without a house. Some cultures you can, but we're not going to go there. So a home is dependent on the idea of a house. What happens when we think about creation as a home story? In a home story, it's going to be theology that provides the plot. It talks about how the various aspects of a home are purposed, how they serve a particular role and function, the ordering of the rooms, the furniture, the household, the organization. When you move into a new house, you are making it your home. Home is where your story comes to life. It's where life happens. When I have students over the house and they ask about our place, they're not interested in the house story. They don't want to know about the plumbing and the foundation and the roof and the air conditioning system. They want to know about our home and how we've made this place our home. When you buy a new house, you can look at it as a house, check out the electricity, check out the basement walls, whether they're leaking. But you can also think about it as a home. Which room is going to serve which purpose? Where are we going to put the different pieces of furniture? The kids want to know which room is theirs. And so in that sense, a home story is very different than a house story. Both are creation stories, but they're different creation stories. A home, for instance, can resolve homelessness. And that sense of home goes far beyond living in a house. So which is the most important story? Well, that depends on your cultural river. Depends which story you want to tell. And so again, for the Bible, we want to understand how their story might be different than our story. So what can we say about their story? If we're going to understand their story and tell a better story for Genesis 1, we have to start by understanding day 7. What's going on here? What's this thing about God resting? When we think about rest, we think about relaxation. We think about leisure time. We think about a nap, putting your feet up. But that doesn't make any sense here with God. And that's because we are unfamiliar with the cultural river of the ancient world. So, for instance, we don't realize that in the ancient world, gods rest in temples. In fact, that's exactly what temples are constructed for deity to rest in. So now we've got a context that we didn't have before. This whole story that ends with God resting evokes the imagery of a temple, of sacred space, of God's presence. That all is part of the cultural river of the ancient world. For them, the temple is the control center of the cosmos. And in that sense, we understand that when God rests in a temple, he doesn't rest in a bed. He doesn't rest on a couch, a recliner, a futon, a hammock. When God rests in a temple, he rests on a throne. God takes up his seat on the throne, and therefore we find out that God's rest is God's rule. On day 7, God ceases his ordering activity to now take command of the cosmos, which he has ordered, just like a CEO orders a company, just like a new president orders a university to work under his command. Now, the Bible does pick up this issue. Let's take a quick look at Psalm 132. It talks about his dwelling place. That's the temple. His footstool. That's the ark. O Lord, come to your resting place. That's the temple. The Lord has chosen Zion, desired it for his dwelling. This is my resting place, and here I will sit enthroned. God's rest is God's rule. So the Genesis story is telling the story of God entering the cosmos that he has ordered, he has created. He created it at every level, by the way. Every aspect he did. The material, the functional, the order, the organization, the set, the stage, he did everything. But which story are they telling? That's the question. And this is about God ordering the cosmos and then coming to dwell in it. So in their story, people may be the climax of the 6 days, but rest is the climax of the creation account. All of that ordering and even creating people doesn't have a lot of meaning until God comes and takes up his rule. Rest, then, God's rule, is the main goal of creation in their story. Resting expresses God having control over this ordered system. Resting then conveys engagement, not disengagement. God's not backing off. He's now engaging the cosmos that he has created. God's resting indicates that there's stability and security, equilibrium. God's rest involves resolving unrest. See, that's what God's about. Bringing order. The opposite of order, the opposite of rest, is turmoil, chaos. And so God brings rest. God rests and he brings rest by virtue of his presence. Genesis 1, the better story, is God preparing a place for us where we might dwell with him in relationship with him. It's a home story. God made a home for us, and then he comes to live there with us, among us. This is their story. What's the 7 days all about then? Why 7 days? What does that have to do with anything? What does it have to do with resting? What does it have to do with creation? What does it have to do with ordering? And again, we have to answer the question from their world, not from ours. We think of the 7 days as somehow a chronology of the house story. But if it's not a house story, but a home story, we might have to think differently. We think of it as 7 days to build the stage. But maybe that's not the point. We have to read their story. By the way, some people are very interested in literal interpretation. I get it. The Bible is true. I believe that. The most literal interpretation is going to be that which understands what the biblical author intended to convey. And that's what we have to try to understand in their story. So to understand the 7 days, we have to think in terms of temple building and temple inauguration. After all, if this is a story that evokes the temple imagery, God dwelling among his people, then we need to try to understand the story in that kind of context. Think about Solomon in the ancient world when he built the temple. 1 Kings tells us that he spent 7 years constructing the temple. That's the house story. 7 years building that temple. But when all of the construction was done, the tools cleared away, the site cleared, and there it stood. A beautiful building. Was it a temple? Well, no, not yet. It's not a temple yet because God is not in it. It's been prepared to be a temple. It's ready to be a temple, but it's not a temple yet. The house story has taken place. The home story has not yet begun. How does it make that transition from the house story to the home story? Well, we get the story in the Bible. They have a temple inauguration. A temple inauguration in which they move in all the furniture and they install the priests, and the temple is ordered so that it's all ready for God to come there. And then, of course, God moves in. God shows up. God comes to dwell there. That's the story of the temple inauguration, where the house becomes a home. And that inauguration takes place in 7 days. That's true of the tabernacle as well. And in fact, it's true in the ancient Near East. We have examples of temple building. Temple building was a really big deal in the ancient world. We have examples of temple building and temple inaugurations. And 7 days is sometimes seen as the amount of time for the inauguration. Giving 7 days to it indicates how important it is. That it's not just an hour-long ceremony. It's 7 days. So the Bible uses 7 days in connection with this temple idea to inaugurate the cosmic temple, sacred space, the cosmos, as a place where God is going to dwell. In that sense, it's more like a set story, not a stage story. It's more like a home story, not a house story. The 7 days is part of the home story. The 7 days is not how long it took to build the house. In this 7 days of Genesis 1, God is bringing order. He's not building the set. He's bringing order to what he has already built materially. Again, then, the 7 days has to do with the identity of the cosmos, not its scientific origins. When we try to read our science story into the text and try to treat it as a house story and try to treat the 7 days as a chronological sequence of the house story, we are not reading the story they wrote. We are reading the story from our cultural river. We need to tell a better story. The better story is the one that pertains to what they had in mind when they wrote it. The 7 days has nothing to do then with the age of the earth. The age of the earth is a house story question. The 7 days has to do with the cosmos becoming a place for God to dwell with us. This is the importance of the ancient Near East, of understanding the ancient Near Eastern background for the Old Testament. And we've used the example of Genesis 1. The better story of faith and science is that the Bible is telling a different story than science is. The science story is an important one, and we want to pay attention to it. It's significant, and it's the story we resonate most with. But it's not the Bible's story. The Bible is telling a different story. So it's a better story of faith and science when we can read the Bible for the story it's telling and understand science for the story it's telling. They're not contradictory. They're compatible stories. And we're going to talk more about that in the next lecture this evening as we think about Genesis 2 and Genesis 3. But for now, that gives us some things to think about, and I'm looking forward to answering some questions.
Well, thank you very much, John, for a fascinating talk. The questions are indeed coming in. Perhaps I could start with a question that relates a little bit to this morning's talk, which was talking about, it discussed the importance of randomness and disorder in the formation of order. And some of our attendees would be interested to know how you view the role of the remaining chaos and randomness in our world.
Yes, we're going to talk about that more this afternoon, but the basic gist of that answer is that I believe that when God ordered the world, he did not totally order it, completely so. And you get that impression in the Bible. There's still the sea, there's still darkness. Those are outside of the realm of order in terms of the ancient Near East. There's an outside the garden, which is less ordered than inside the garden. And in fact, God creates people in his image to work alongside him to continue bringing order. And so God ordered the world optimally, that is, enough for us to dwell here. But his intention is to continue the ordering process. And again, we are in his image to work alongside him to do that. So, yes, not everything today is ordered, though we should also learn the lesson of Job. That is, in Job 38, 39 particularly, there's more order than we know, even in things that look to us to be lacking order.
Thank you. On a different subject, you said that the ancients wouldn't have had any difficulty understanding the text. Was that always true, or would some of the texts been enigmatic even for them?
An interesting question. I think that the message of the writers, compilers, etc., were clear to them. After all, the Israelites were expected to respond to that message. Oftentimes when we ask the question that you posed, we're thinking of prophecy. And I would draw the distinction that the Israelite audience understood well the message of the prophet, and therefore they knew what they were supposed to do. They did not always understand what fulfillment would look like, but that's a different thing entirely. They understood the message, and that was the important part. Fulfillment would happen in its time. So yes, I think that they did understand the text, especially, of course, the cultural aspects of it.
We have, in fact, a question from this morning's speaker. If rest is equal to rule, why do the Sabbath commands directed towards humans focus on not working? Why aren't we commanded to do some ruling on the Sabbath in recognition of creation rather than not working?
Thank you. I don't usually cover that in my lecture because I'm always sure someone will ask it and I get to address it in the questions. So thank you for asking it. Yes, it changes how we think about the Sabbath. We usually think about it in terms of imitating God. God stopped his work and relaxed, so we would think, and so we're supposed to stop our work. Okay, but instead of imitating, I would propose that we need to think in terms of participating. That is, we work 6 days a week to try to bring order to our world, to put food on the table, to pay the bills, to bring order to our world. Our work is directed toward ordering our world. What the Sabbath says is that on the seventh day, you recognize that you are not the one in charge of ordering. God is the one who orders the world. God is the one who orders our lives. God is on the throne, not you. And therefore, the idea of Sabbath is we set aside our own ordering attempts, our 6 days, and refocus on God as the one who brings order to our lives. We set aside our anxieties and our tensions and our stress, and we recognize that God is the one who gives us rest. And the absence of turmoil comes when we adopt a kingdom perspective that transcends our circumstances. And so in that sense, the rest of the Sabbath is a rest that is a refocus. And I think you pick that up, not so much in the Pentateuch, where it's telling us what we shouldn't do, but in a place like Isaiah 58, where it helps refocus what we should be thinking about.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Which particular ancient Near East cultural perspective do you think resonates most with Genesis 1? Egypt, Babylon, Canaan? Again,
an excellent question. We find more resonance with Mesopotamian because we have so much more literature from Mesopotamia. We have over 1 million cuneiform texts, and that gives us a great entree into the ancient world. But there are pieces from all of it. And in fact, many of the things that I talk about as being commonalities, you could find in Egypt, you could find in Mesopotamia, you could find in Syria, you can find them all over the place. When I talk about, for instance, natural and supernatural, that's all across the ancient world. When I talk about creation as ordering, that's everywhere. You find it in Egypt, you find it in Babylon. So in that sense, these are kind of common denominators across the ancient world. So in that sense, I'm drawing from the whole range, but certainly it's Mesopotamia that gives us the largest amount of information.
Mm. Are there other examples of structuring ancient Near East poetry or prose using the language of a series of days when it's not intended to be taken chronologically?
Mm-hmm. The information from the ancient Near East does not use a 7-day structure to talk about creation. There's one instance of a 7-day structure in the Ugaritic material that's from the area north of Israel, Canaanite sort of culture. In that material, Baal builds his house in 7 days, but that 7 days is the only connection there. Again, where you find the 7 days is in the temple inauguration ceremonies. And by the way, I should note the temple building and temple inauguration are often viewed in the context of creation. And so in that sense, those are intimately connected. But the idea of 7 days of creation is not something that we find in the ancient texts.
In your talk, you touched on the fact of some taking the Bible literally and some not. So how are we supposed to decide which parts of the Bible are just a story and what bits are meant to be taken literally? For example, how do we know which people mentioned are real or just characters?
Yes, thank you. I always want to read the Bible the way that the author intended me to read it. That means I have to really pay attention to genre. I have to pay attention to rhetorical devices. All of those things are important for understanding how the author wants me to read it. The author may intend a metaphor, and then I better read it as a metaphor. You know, God is a rock. Okay, that's a metaphor. The author may intend a parable, and then I need to read it as a parable. And it's not always easy to discern exactly what the author intended. We always run into difficulties in places like the book of Jonah or the book of Job. Did these people really exist? And those kinds of ideas. My default is to think that these are real people and that everybody showing up in the Bible are real people in a real past. And that's because my experience with ancient Near Eastern texts is that they're not making people up. They don't tend to do that. And so I tend to accept that they are treating it as reality. Now, again, I'm going to talk about that some in the next lecture when we get to Adam and Eve.
In terms of the Genesis text, which ancient era do you think it belongs to? Was it compiled in the time of Daniel, as some suggest?
There's a lot of question marks about the whole process of composition. The ancient world is orally dominant, hearing dominant. And as a result, the first impulse was not to write something down. Most things that we have in the Bible were communicated and transmitted orally over centuries. Now, some of them had parts written down as well, but most people couldn't read, and there was not general accessibility to literature. Things that were written were put in archives and not really accessible to a general public, even if they could read. And so most of the transmission of the text throughout the Old Testament period is in oral terms. The formulation of those oral traditions into a text that we call a biblical book is the last step in the process. People don't sit down to write a book in the ancient world. Eventually, the traditions are compiled into a book. That means that with something like Genesis, we don't know when it was finally compiled. Probably later rather than earlier in their history, but that doesn't mean that the traditions don't have authentic ancient roots, because that's how their culture worked, a hearing dominant culture. There's a lot more that could be said about that. I did a book called The Lost World of Scripture, and people can find a lot more discussion about that topic there.
What would be your preference to describe the genre of Genesis 1 to 3? Would you say it's myth or theological history or a novel or history in ancient Near East terms?
Good. Here again, we run into our cultural river problem because all of the genre terms and categories that we use are our terms and categories. And for us to call something this or that, history or myth or poetry, may have different aspects than someone in the ancient world would refer to it. The most careful genre studies try to use genre labels that the ancient Near East itself gives. But of course, we don't have all that many of those that can help us do that. And so it becomes a difficult thing to try to squeeze Genesis, the first couple chapters, into one of our genre categories. There are aspects of it that may be one or the other. Do I believe that it's true? Yes. Do I believe that it's real? Yes. Is reality limited to something that we call history? No. Reality is bigger than history. And therefore, how do we define that reality? In some ways, I wouldn't object at all to saying it's history, meaning that it really happened, but that's not really the strict definition of history. So the result is that I'm not sure I can assign a genre label to it. There's nothing quite like it in the ancient world. And when we talk about genre, what we're doing is grouping it together with other similar pieces. There are no similar pieces, not in our world, not in their world. And so genre becomes a difficult, if not a moot point.
We have a question here about the number 7. Did it originate from the Babylonian number system? Did the Babylonian and other Near East people value temple building as did the Israelites?
Oh, they valued temple building greatly. Again, the most important things that an ancient ruler could boast about was building a temple. And you see this in all the royal inscriptions. They talk about their wars, their conquests, and their temple building. That is the most important thing because that's what they did to please a god. And when they pleased a god, they believed that they would receive favors from the god, protection, provision. And so building a temple was one of the most important things they could do. And again, the 7 days is found in some of these temple building contexts. So we know that the 7 days was an important marker for them. Having said that, in the ancient Babylonian system, they do not have a 7-day week, and therefore they're not just clicking into a 7-day week. Also, in the Babylonian number system, it's what's called a sexagesimal system, which is based on 6s and 10s. And so 7 is not generally a very important number in that kind of system. But again, we know that they did temple inaugurations in 7 days, so that has some importance to them, most likely linked to the phases of the moon, because they had a lunar calendar, and therefore the month, 28 days, 30 days, was based on the cycles, which approximated 7 days.
Is Genesis based on other ancient Near East creation stories, like from other cultures from Mesopotamia?
That's the issue of indebtedness that I was talking about. And I don't believe that it is. I don't believe Genesis is sort of using and reformatting and revising some other creation story that they know about. So I don't believe that it's indebted to some ancient piece of literature. But at the same time, it has the same view of what creation is as you find all across the ancient world. And when I say what creation is, I'm referring to the home story, to the ordering process, to the idea of God creating a place where he rules and where he dwells. Those ideas. But you don't get that from a piece of literature, although it's evident in so many of the pieces of literature. That's something that's simply in the cultural river. And Israel is drawing from that same cultural river as the other cultures. So they all believed that the gods, or in Israel's case, God, was involved in ordering the world, in creation, and in dwelling among people. They all believed that, but they didn't have to borrow it from one another. It's part of the cultural river. And what's important is that each story has its own twist on that. Each story has its own interpretation of the significance of God ordering the world, and especially of which God ordered the world and what his purposes were. And so what's important is not the common elements, although they help us to understand the ancient world perspective. What's important are the differences, because they help us understand the unique perspectives of, in this case, the Israelites' way of thinking.
Well, what do you think is the main obstacle for people to understand that the house and the home stories are different stories?
Well, the main obstacle is people don't even think about this. People assume their own cultural river, and therefore they assume the creation is a house story. So in that sense, the main obstacle is our presuppositions, our entrenched thinking, our lack of knowledge of the ancient world, our failure to recognize that there are different stories that can be told. And I think those things all get in the way. Once we recognize that the story can be told different ways, like my example with the play, when we recognize that there are different ways you can talk about creation, then that opens the path to trying to figure out, okay, which way did the Bible do it, instead of trying to read it as a science book.
I think one final question before our time is up. Your understanding of order sounds very like the Enlightenment understanding of William Paley. How would you distinguish between ancient and post-Enlightenment order?
In many senses, our ideas about what constitutes order haven't changed much. When we think about what reflects order to us, there are a lot of continuities that would exist. We like things to run smoothly in life. In the pandemic that we're currently in, things seem very much out of order. And we're looking for order. We're looking for turmoil to be resolved. And so I think these are often common to humanity. Again, the difference that I'm suggesting is that for the ancient world, they thought of creation in terms of order. And I think that would be a distinction. I can't address much Paley and the Enlightenment. Again, that's not an area of my specialty. But I can observe that many things are the same between the ancient world and ours in terms of how we think about order. And we will address that more this afternoon as well.
Well, thank you, John, for a wonderfully insightful talk. And thank you as well to the audience for providing us with excellent questions for discussion.
Thank you.